Somebody else in. Good morning, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to this talk. I think we'll get going here. I'm going to introduce Karthik, who's going to lead this session for us. Karthik builds and leads teams that solve emerging problems which span disciplines and cross borders. He is president and co-founder of Actual, an Oakland-based company whose software enables forward-thinking leaders to create comprehensive, concrete plans to turn climate goals into reality. Previously, he founded Airbus A3 Altiscope, now called Airbus UTM, to modernize the air traffic control system and integrate new aircraft, such as air taxis, into the airspace, working with regulators from the USA, EU, UK, China, Singapore, New Zealand, and other nations. He was also the CTO and co-founder of Coin, acquired by Fitbit, a consumer electronics and fintech company. So Karthik, welcome. Thanks for being here, and take it away.
Great, thanks for having me today. And thanks everyone for joining from all around the world. I'm gonna share my screen here. I'll stop my video just to make sure that the bandwidth is really good for the audio. And I'll talk for about 25, 30 minutes, and I figure we can have a good discussion afterwards as well. So there's some areas intentionally that I've kind of left more to provoke questions and discussion than anything else. So let me share my screen here and we can get going. Is everyone able to see my screen? Perfect. All right. So thanks for the introduction. My name is Karthik. I'm co-founder and president of Actual. And today I'll be talking about how to achieve essentially urban environmental goals, and a little bit about how private enterprise has a pretty substantial role to play in meeting these goals. So just a little bit about Actual and who we are. What we've seen over the last few years, and this has really come to head during COP26, is companies and governments as well have ESG goals, right? We're going to be net zero by 2050. We're going to be net zero by 2030. We're going to cut our emissions by X, Y, and Z. And there's a lot of work that companies have done around things like carbon accounting, right? You've got the CDP reports that have to get filed annually. Not every company does a good job. Some do, some don't. But in general, there's a good sense of where we are, right? So that's the point on the graph at time zero. And there's a good sense of where we want to be 30 years down the road. But what's really missing is everything in between, right? How are we actually going to get from where we are today to net zero? Beyond, hey, we're just going to buy a bunch of credits and call it a day. Planning is really tough. It's really complex. There's hundreds of things that companies can do. And they kind of get stuck in what we're calling an ESG gap, which is transformation is large. Transformation is expensive. It can cost billions of dollars for these companies. And it's really hard for them to say, yes, let's go and replace all of our trucks. Let's go and put rooftop solar. Because should they do rooftop solar? Should they go sign a PPA with the local utility? Should they be doing geothermal? What should they be doing? And if you have thousands of sites around the world, it's going to be some combination. We'll talk a bit about that later on. So what we're building at Actual is software to help close this gap. So physics-based, chemistry-based modeling, really to help companies do this scenario planning and say, with this multitude of options, directionally, what should I do? So just again, a little bit about what we've done. We just announced a partnership with 2000 Watt Smart Cities Association and the Police Innovation Institute to work with cities around the world. So 2000 Watt Smart Cities, for example, has worked with the city of Zurich to build a greenfield neighborhood that's close to around 2000 watts per person, and is now working to scale this internationally, for example, in neighborhoods around Pune, India, and other places. And we've been working for the last few years now with Giga, which is a UNICEF, ITU, and SoftBank collaboration, basically to connect schools around the world to the internet. One of the challenges there is it's easy to say, well, let's connect schools to the internet, but when there's no grid, you need power. You have to bring power in. Do you do solar? Do you extend the grid? You need now power for the computers. That there's no point having a Wi-Fi signal if the computers can't get powered, or the phones can't get powered. So we're basically helping organizations that operate at a very large scale, whether they're government, whether they're private, across thousands of sites. So just a quick plug about Actual, just kind of contextualize where the analysis that I'm doing comes from. And if anyone's interested in learning more, feel free to shoot me an email. The slides will be made available, and my email address is there. And we can always chat more anytime in the future. So assertion, I don't think it's really that this is not new for those of you here, but cities are growing really, really fast. The UN projects that about 68% of the world population is going to live in urban areas by 2050. This really is, it doesn't sound huge necessarily, but this is about 3 million people every month, maybe 4 million now, spurred by COVID, in fact, moving to cities for opportunity every single month, right? 1 million people a week. So think about a San Francisco, think about a Seattle, think about, a San Diego every single week of urban population, right? This is really incredible. This is crazy. And it's a scale that's really quite unprecedented. And the scale that when we think about climate has to be addressed and it has to be accounted for, right? Because we're not going to be able to stop people from moving to cities. They're doing this for opportunity. They're doing this for a better life. And so the question becomes, how do we accommodate these people moving to cities in a way that doesn't dramatically increase our emissions and in fact allows us to reduce our emissions globally? And this is interesting because if you look at this trend, it's not just in emerging markets, it's worldwide. So of course, India and China are kind of the obvious places you look to say, okay, well, in the 50s and the 60s, very rural populations, a little bit of cities. And of course, we've already seen in China, dramatic depopulation of rural areas into the urban areas as the population has grown. India is following a very similar curve, a bit less forced, but about 10 to 15 years kind of, shifted in time, but really it's going to look the same, where by 2050, 2060, 2070, the vast majority of the population growth is going to be in urban areas. Even in the United States, right, we're not necessarily going to see a huge depopulation of rural and suburban areas, but we're going to see massive urban growth. And of course, countries like Indonesia as well, which started with even higher rural population percentage, are going to really go the way of dramatic urbanization. And this provides a lot of challenges, and it provides a lot of opportunity as well, because when we think about efficiency, when we think about dealing with climate, urban environments tend to be a lot more efficient, right? In terms of moving goods around, moving services around, in terms of transportation, in terms of energy, right? Apartment buildings, for example, are easier and more efficient to heat and cool than single family homes. You can do a lot of things around, heating, around power, around, mass transit, things like that. But there's a lot of challenges as well because of sort of how we think about finance and where that finance goes. And I'll touch upon those a bit later on in the talk. Well, when you think about what a city needs to grow, right? Think about 1 million people moving into a city every week. You need the agricultural systems to get the food into these cities. You need industry and manufacturing to support all the things that these people need, right? Even if you're only going to go and buy 1 pair of clothes every year, that's 1 million pairs of pants that need to get made, every week for those people moving to those cities. Think about how much water gets used, pumping the water, treating the water, and of course, once the water gets used and goes down the drain, treating the wastewater and discharging that or using it for agriculture. Think about how much energy goes into running a transportation network. How many more buses have to be purchased? Communications is a big one. What's really interesting is people don't think about cell phones and cell phone networks and about internet as being a huge draw on energy. But in many countries, running the communications network is a huge source of power needs. I mean, just think about how much power your phone uses. Now think about how much more power a cell phone tower is going to use. In a lot of rural areas where there is no grid, most of these towers are driven by diesel generators, and you've got maybe no roads, and people are flying in literally weekly with a helicopter to fill up the tanks on these diesel generators. So there's a huge energy need. And of course, as that gets urbanized, you're talking about a huge amount of generation capacity that needs to get built for all these cities. And of course, healthcare is a big one. We did a project a couple of years ago with a group that's building oncology centers in West Africa. And one of their big challenges is as soon as you start thinking about CAT scanners and PET scanners and recovery rooms, you're talking about multiple megawatts of power necessary for one single healthcare facility. So 1 million people moving into cities a week, how many hospitals do you need to build every single week to meet that demand? How much power is going to be necessary to keep all that equipment running, to keep the air conditioned, et cetera? Right? Energy is life. And we have to think about this from the perspective of how much energy are we bringing to these places to make this happen. So I always like to start thinking about things through the fundamentals, right? So how much energy is actually necessary to meet these goals? And then from there, we can start thinking about what are different players going to actually do to meet these needs. So we started by looking at 2 factors. One of them was how much per capita energy is being used today, and HDI. Now, HDI is not a perfect metric. There's other metrics that talk about quality of life for sure, and we can go into a debate about whether HDI is the right metric at all. But it's a metric, and it's decently good to kind of to get a sense of how quality of life kind of tracks with energy. And we weren't really sure if we were going to see anything here or not. Now, this daily average per capita energy consumption that I'm going to be talking about, that's not necessarily how much is being used directly by the person, but it's how much is being used for everything necessary in that country divided by the number of people, right? So this includes defense, it includes transportation, it includes agriculture, right? So when you buy a tomato at the farmer's market, there's energy that was used to strip that tomato, even if you're not paying for that energy directly, that's accounted for here. So pulling this data, energy data came from the World Bank and HDI data came from UNDP, you actually see a really interesting trend, which is that in general, energy consumption and HDI track really closely. Now, some countries are using a lot of energy and they haven't been able to do a very good job in terms of meeting HDI goals, and other countries are using a lot of energy and maybe very inefficiently, right? So there's a lot of room for improvement. But one of the really important things is that if you kind of look at this trend, you need somewhere between 50 and 100 kilowatt hours per person per day for everything needed to support their life, right? So that gives you about 2,000 watts, directly in the city, and about 2,000 watts sort of indirectly, right? Again, for defense, for agriculture, for water pumping and treatment and transportation and all that kind of stuff. And this is kind of tricky because if you think about some of these countries that have much lower HDI, they're way, 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 way under at 50 to 100 kilowatt hours per person, right? So how are you going to take someone who is using 20 kilowatt hours and bring them up to 50? If you've got cities in countries where the average person is using 20 kilowatt hours, and you think about the number of people moving in, building generation is really important, but building efficiency is important too, because there are certain cities here, for example, certain countries that are able to do it much less, right? They're able to hit 0.87, 0.9 at 50 kilowatt hours per person per day. So there's a really interesting tension here between let's go and build a bunch of energy capacity and let's go and work on more and more efficient technologies, right? And it's kind of a balance that I think each company is going to have to figure out as they go and deploy. And I'll talk about that in a few slides. And when I talk about simply, when I talk about the tension, it's really evident when you look at the top of this graph. Just having more energy is not going to translate to an improved HDI, right? Just because you burn a bunch of energy doesn't mean you're going to have a good quality of life. So again, it sounds obvious, but it kind of isn't, in the sense that a lot of folks think, well, we'll just build a bunch of generation capacity and our lives are going to improve, right? You have to couple this with how are we directing the energy? What are we using it for? And are we balancing out that growth in energy production with, or generation of power rather, with how we're deploying these things? So a few key takeaways from this very high level analysis. The first one is you can't simply copy the most inefficient societies, right? So at the top right of the graph is US, is a lot of American-like countries, a lot of Western Europe. You can't simply copy the most inefficient societies, right? A lot of this comes down to we're designing new technology, we're deploying new technology, right? So it's not simply how do we take what exists in the US, for example, and deployed around the world, it's based on new ways of living, based on the folks that are moving to the cities, culturally, what they're looking for. How do we improve their quality of life, leveraging the new things? The second thing, and this is an assertion, it's not really a takeaway from the energy analysis because I'll get into this later, but a climate positive pathway for development is 100% possible. There is a way to meet this increased energy, to improve HDI, while also getting to net zero emissions. And this is really important because I think there's a bit of a tension, right, between, degrowth and supporting all this population. And on my view, very firmly, is that we don't have to make that trade-off. It's about being intentional about picking the right technologies. It's being intentional about deploying things that are right for the context, but focusing on improving that quality of life across the board. And finally, energy has diminishing returns, right? Again, just increasing generation by 10x is not going to improve quality of life by 10x. It just encourages folks to use the energy in less efficient ways. So you have to be very concerted about, number one, how you're increasing that capacity, and B, how you're using that capacity. So how do we achieve this? Kind of how we look at it at Actual is the first one is a kind of a mass customization approach. And this seems a little silly, but I'll get into this in a couple of slides and it'll become kind of evident what this means. Getting past the analysis paralysis, right? Actually just taking action, and then ensuring equity. And this is where I want to open it up for discussion as well, because I think this is where private enterprise has a really big role to play, but I think also where private enterprise has failed and is failing right now, because just because we're trying to solve one problem, climate change, doesn't mean we're necessarily caring about how those problems get solved and implemented. So mass customization really is around this idea that every site, every community, or every company has different needs. So if you think about some of the work that we were doing with UNICEF, we had schools that were in villages where the closest grid was 50 kilometers away. We had other schools that were literally in the middle of the city where they had electricity, they had surplus electricity, they already had solar on the rooftop. Those obviously are going to have different needs. So going into a rural village and saying, well, here's a solution that works in an urban school, here you go, that's a model for failure. And vice versa, right? Coming into the urban school and saying, well, we're going to put a generator is also backwards because they don't need the generator. You're just increasing emissions for no reason. So every site, every community, every company has different needs. So if you think about a warehouse, right? In this warehouse, one of the challenges is folks try to create bespoke solutions site by site. And from our perspective, what mass customization is about is saying we need a menu of options, right? There's a bunch of different ways to get power. There's a bunch of different ways to do transportation. There's a bunch of different ways to do material handling in the warehouse, for example. And what's necessary is for regions to coalesce on options, which are available sort of as a palette within that region for different businesses, right? Because at the end of the day, mass production is a really good way to bring efficiency into play, but cookie cutter approaches are a really good way to ensure that the solutions don't really work, because you're going to end up with things that are inefficient in one location and efficient for another. And why does mass customization become really important? So, this is kind of where when I mentioned, I talk about how it's 100% possible to reach the equity while still getting to 100% net zero. Today, there's about 43 terawatt hours of energy being used today. This is our estimate. If you look at different estimates, they vary from about 35 to 55, give or take. But from the data set that we used, about 43 terawatt hours a day. And if you want to get worldwide HDI greater than 0.9, you're going to add about 33, 34 terawatt hours a day of energy usage. Now, today, there's about 40 gigatons a year of CO2 being emitted. Now, when you talk to folks who are focused on carbon capture, for example, they'll use gigatons of carbon per year. So just keep in mind, I'm using CO2, not C. So there's a multiplier there because of the chemical mass that you have to take into account. But if you take the least polluting sources of energy, right? So if you look at NREL's data and you say, we're going to use solar, we're going to use wind, we're going to use hydro, and we're going to do these things in the best possible way, you can generate an additional 32 terawatt hours a day with about 6 gigatons a year of CO2 life cycle emissions. Now, that's really critical to keep in mind because you're not going to be able to put solar everywhere. There are certain places where solar is not the solution. Maybe it's going to be wind, maybe it's going to be geothermal, maybe it's going to be hydro, right? But that mass customization is really important because coming out and saying, we're going to reach this just through one solution is a way to make sure we don't hit that 6 gigatons additional CO2. It's a way to get to 10, 15, 20, because you're now going to have to oversize solar in certain places or oversize wind in other places, leading to higher life cycle emissions. Similarly, if we now go and say we're going to replace the existing sources of generation with new sources of generation, we can bring the existing, about 36 gigatons a year down to about 8. Again, life cycle, right? So there's going to be some emissions in making the battery and in making the solar panels, et cetera. But again, mass customization becomes key. It can't be one solution everywhere. And the other thing here is involved in this is not actually reducing this energy usage. So note for a second that I haven't actually touched efficiency improvements, right? So can you get the same quality of life with less than 43 terawatt hours a day? And the answer is absolutely yes, because this population that's using 33 terawatt hours is bigger than this population, right? So all of this assumptions says we're not making any efficiency improvements, right? We're not going to cities and replacing cars with buses. We're not going and replacing cars with e-bikes. We're not, building apartment buildings and dense walkable cities, for example. We're not using soil sequestration and other kind of things in agriculture. This is just saying we're doing business as usual in most of the world, except for power plants. So when we want to achieve net zero, our existing sinks can sink about, again, 8 gigatons of CO2 a year. When you compare that to carbon, of course, that number is going to be different, right? Because CO2 versus C. This number, 5.5 gigatons a year of CO2 of new sinks, whether it's soil sequestration or direct air capture or what have you, that's extremely ambitious. So in order to do this, we have to now start thinking about, again, community by community, how do we improve that efficiency? What's going to work in that area to improve things? Because this number needs to get brought down. We are absolutely 100% going to need new sinks, whether it's synthetic technological solutions to carbon capture or natural solutions. But to say that we're almost going to double our capacity in a short time period is going to be quite difficult. My perspective on it. The second thing is analysis paralysis, right? So I've thrown a bunch of data at you. I've said this is very complicated. And the challenge there is everybody kind of gets stuck in this thing of, well, let's go do a study for 5 years. Let's go do a study for 10 years. Let's go do a bunch of experiments that are super small scale that don't really have a way of moving out. I mean, just an example of this. So I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there's this transit agency called VTA. And VTA did a pilot with electric buses. It's a very interesting pilot. They got a lot of data, but one of the questions that was asked at the end is, okay, so what's next? You trialed electric buses on these 3 routes. You said the test was a success. Are you going to scale these up? And they're like, well, we're not really sure. We have a lot of analysis to do, a lot of data to crunch. Well, the answer is, yeah, they should start replacing the older diesel buses with battery buses, right? Like, it's kind of the obvious solution, but a lot of agencies get stuck in this analysis paralysis, and a lot of companies get stuck in analysis paralysis as well. Because what's kind of needed, a lot of times people think, is it's $1 billion program. We need to do a really exacting, detailed, complete plan before we can take the first step. And so our approach that we take at Actual, and I think this is really critical for companies to take, is a quick start approach, right? Implement the solution rapidly on a small scale, not as a data collection exercise, but as a real exercise, right? As a real thing. So don't say we're going to replace 2 buses and it's a pilot program and we'll see what happens. Just say, we are going to replace all our buses, for example. We are going to replace all of our furnaces in our factory with heat pumps. We're just going to start with 2 because it's a low-hanging fruit, but eventually we're going to replace them all, right? So you don't constrain and time-bound and box to say it's just going to be 2 and then we'll see what happens. You say we start with 2, we're going to do them all eventually. Because once you start to build momentum, you can say, did this work? Did this not work? But you've already set out the next steps before you even get started. You've committed to acting. Because one of the really interesting things that came out of the IEA report earlier this year was that we actually have all the technological solutions we need to hit our 2030 climate goals. They already exist, right? We need better better technology for 2040 goals, 2050 goals, and so on and so forth. But what's getting in the way is people just adopting those technologies, saying, in my business, I'm going to go ahead and, replace again, the aging furnace with a heat pump. I'm going to replace the aging bus with a battery bus. I'm going to go ahead and replace these aging, cars with electric cars, or get some e-bikes to move around the facilities instead of gas-powered golf carts. Technologies exist, but what's missing is someone coming out and saying, you know what, let's go sign that PO. Let's go ahead and purchase that equipment. The last thing I want to talk about before I open it up for discussion, I've got one more graph after this, which will really kind of put this into perspective, is equity in solutions. So I think one of the real mantras that people have when they're, especially when they're building a startup and when they're building technologies from scratch, is, let me solve a problem that I have, right? I face this problem personally, so I'm going to solve it. And that's a really good way to start. But when we're talking about a global challenge, it's not a great way to scale. So one of the things I think is really critical as you're developing new technologies, as you're developing new products and services, is thinking about how your solutions and how your technologies can be broadly applied beyond your immediate communities. Because there's a lot of communities around the world which need solutions. And unfortunately, because of the way that financing works today, because of the way that capital markets work today, because of the availability of VC funding, of grants, things like that, don't have the ability necessarily to build those technologies today, right? So if you're building something, how far can you go? Are you building it just to make your life better? Or is there a way where, a year down the road, you can modify your product to solve problems around the world? The next thing, and this is something that I took from my experience at Coin, is DFM, design for manufacturing, super important. A lot of people, like if you've been in mass production, obviously this is something that's really been drilled into your head. But if you haven't been through mass production ramps before, designing for manufacturing, designing for scale from the very beginning is going to be incredibly critical to solving the climate challenge. Again, 1 million people a week moving into cities means that if you're building something that helps city growth, how is there a pathway where your product can be built to serve 1 million people more per week, right? Are you thinking about scale? Are you thinking about cost? Or are you building something that is so bespoke that you'll never get there? This is extremely critical, and it can slow you down by months or even years, having an initial product and trying to redesign for high volume production, right? We've seen Tesla struggling with this, for example, right? As they try and ramp. Now, Tesla is kind of a different story, but this happens at all scales of products. The third one is, does your product rely on major subsidies? So the reason that this is important is because a lot of the places that are facing these issues don't have money to provide subsidies. So if your solution requires 50, 60, 70% of the cost to be subsidized by the government, how is a government that doesn't have money to subsidize you going to be able to deploy this into their communities? How are the communities that there's 1 million people a week moving into, how are they going to utilize your product, right? So is there a pathway for whatever you're building to be self-sustaining? Because as soon as you require subsidies in sort of the more emerging markets, they're going to rely on grants. They're going to rely on development finance. They're going to rely on a variety of financial instruments that actually might be quite regressive. So the more self-sustaining the products that you're building from a financial perspective, the more and better your impact is going to be long term. And the final one, of course, is your source of finance equitable, right? One of the things that we've seen is we did a little bit of work with a group that's basically trying to deploy solar in South America and in Central Asia for use on farms. And one of the challenges here is, about 10% of power used in most countries goes towards pumping water. It goes towards extracting water through wells. It goes towards treating the water, cleaning the water, moving the water around. Water is really, really heavy and it's not everywhere, right? So it's got to get moved from where it is to where it's going. And this group, they were basically going to farms and trying to sell solar panels to replace the diesel generators, right? Because the idea was, instead of going and trying to fill the diesel generator every week, you just had the panel there and it would power the pump, and you go and you do it once and you're good to go. And you don't have to worry about fuel shortages and things like that. The uptake from the farmers was abysmal. None of the farmers wanted to switch. And they were like scratching their heads. Why? Well, when we talked to them, the answer was obvious, because the way the finance worked was that the bank that was making the loan was going to put a lien on the farm itself. And the farmer would pay pegged to the rate of fuel until the loan was paid back. But what if there's a drought? What if there's what if there's a blight on the crop? What if there's a fire? Something happens, the farmer is getting put in a position where the bank takes over their farm, right, to pay for those panels. So no farmer is going to sign up for that. They're going to be like, well, wait a minute, I own this farm. It's been in my family for generations. Yeah, going and getting diesel is a pain, but at least I'm not going to lose the farm. I'll just have to go there and pump water by hand. So thinking about, it's not just about saying we've got this really great solution we can deploy to a farm. It's thinking about, is this a financial solution that the farmer is going to sign up for? And if the answer is, at the end of the day, the farmer could lose their land by buying our product, they're not going to sign up, and your solution is, quite frankly, worthless. So that's really critical. How are people going to buy your product, and is that going to put them in a bad spot? This is the last chart I wanted to show when I talk about equity. And it's a lot of points, it's kind of complex, so I'll walk through it. But this is a graph from California. And on the x-axis is the percentage of population in a zip code that is Black or Hispanic. So from 0 to 100. Each dot is a zip code. And on the y-axis are the charging ports per 1,000 cars. Actually, this is charging ports per 1,000 EVs registered. So what you're seeing basically is that in California, right, very progressive state, you have a huge amount of investment in EV chargers in majority white and majority Asian zip codes. Right, there's a lot of money being poured into charging networks in Palo Alto and Santa Monica, in West LA, in parts of San Diego. But if you go into neighborhoods that are 50% Black or Hispanic or more, there are chargers, but it's one-offs. It's the guy who owns the corner store puts a charger up because he bought an EV. It's the city has a charger here or there for public usage, but it's not large-scale private investment into networks. Right now, this is data from last summer. There's a few dots that have started to appear over on the right, but not many. So when we start thinking about, EVs, when we start thinking about EV subsidies, when we start thinking about, EVs as a solution to climate change, if you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have public chargers, if you're driving around in areas that don't have public chargers, is an EV going to work for you? That calculus is going to look very different depending on if you live in Palo Alto or you live in East Palo Alto. It's going to look very different if you live in, Piedmont or somewhere, nicer area or near Oakland versus East Oakland or West Oakland. And so this for me is incredibly important to, for everyone to keep in mind, because just because you're solving a climate challenge, because you're a new company that's kind of avoiding, the problems of the past, doesn't mean that equity is going to come by default, right? Your financing model might require a certain IRR. There might be a hurdle that you have to hit. In order to optimize for the hurdle, you end up putting chargers in neighborhoods that already have EVs, or you end up putting chargers in neighborhoods where you feel like that growth is going to be higher. What we found basically is that climate investments in general, in sort of majority, quote unquote, majority neighborhoods, tend to lead adoption, right? So people actually go and they build charging networks in majority white and Asian neighborhoods before there's a lot of EVs. But the investment in majority Black and Hispanic neighborhoods lags adoption. People wait until there's a lot of EVs in those neighborhoods before they build the charging networks. They say, okay, there's less risk. So thinking about how you deploy these things and having a, like really actually keeping a mind towards equity in your deployment is going to be incredibly important, because otherwise you're going to decarbonize part of the society. You're going to start penalizing carbon, and you're going to have a huge group of people who are now left behind because they're paying for that carbon without a way to get off of it. So that's the end of this of the formal slides. Figured I could open it up for discussion from here.
Thanks, Karthik. It looks like, Jay, you've had some questions. Do you want to verbalize those, or?
Yes, if I can get myself off of mute. That was good stuff. I found that really interesting. Karthik, I mean, actually, to ask my questions, would you mind sharing your slides again?
Sure. Give me 1 second here.
And like the one with the factory and the custom mass customization.
Oops.
Yeah, that one. So I'm sitting here looking at it and I'm like, okay, great, let's build a climate-oriented product to solve some problem. But then I would say, okay, now I need to go justify this with my finance org and the business case to support it. I find that mass customization model challenging because the ambiguity presented by, well, in this scenario, they might pick this solution and should I fund that? Or in this other scenario, they might pick that solution and should I fund that? Like, how does that get solved?
So the way it gets solved is that in general, you're talking about several thousand sites. So let's say that you are a major warehouse operator like a Prologis, for example, right? Yeah. You're going to have 10,000 sites around the world. And so the reason that mass customization works is because you're coming and saying, these, here's energy. These 3,000 sites we're going to assign PPAs. These 2,000 sites we're going to do solar. These 1,000 sites we're going to do this thing. So when you bucket it by use case, you're still doing a mass deployment, right? So each configuration might look different, but you're using the same set of building blocks. And so you validated solar as an approach. You validate and you have a set of GCs and a workflow and a process that works for that. You've validated signing PPAs as an approach. Your lawyers are familiar with that. You have a set of standard contracts for signing PPAs, et cetera. So you have a toolbox that says, okay, for heating, we've got heat pumps, we've got X, Y, and Z. And so it's kind of a matrix at that point, right? Where you're saying on one axis, you've got your sites, and on one axis, you've got the solutions. And you're basically just picking which solutions go where, as opposed to saying each site is totally bespoke, because at that point, you get into the problem that you're saying where you have, 3,000 totally different non-replicable or 10,000 totally non-replicable things. On the other hand, you have one configuration that works really well in, say, Phoenix, but it doesn't work at the warehouse in Boise, for example. So it's breaking that tension up and saying, we're going to do, like, each site is going to look different, but they're built from the same building blocks. And this is actually something that we came up when working with Giga, because so far we've done this for about 100,000 schools. They're not connecting the first ones, right? So they haven't connected 100,000 schools yet. But how do you go to a finance minister and education minister and say, this is a solution that's going to work for every single school when every single school has a different need? Same challenge.
Okay, so effectively, like, templated out of, I'm thinking like a quick service restaurant, because that's something that I've dealt with, like small, medium, large shop. This is the bill of materials for this shop and the product solution and so on. Okay.
Exactly.
That makes sense. And then can you just go back to one of the first charts you showed, like the HDI?
Yep.
I think you answered this one. This is just a correlation, right? And I think you answered it by way of that last red dot, that it's not really a causal relationship. Like, you don't need energy to get to a high HDI, or do you?
You do, but there's one axis missing here, which is the efficiency of how the energy is being used, right? So if you think about, for example, in order to grow food, you need energy to pump the water, you need energy to make the fertilizer, you need energy to run all the farm equipment, right? Just in order to have the tomato growing on the vine. Then you've got to have energy to transfer all the workers from their homes to the farms and back to pick the crops. You've got to transport those crops from the farm through the processing center to the store or the farmer's market or to wherever you're buying the food. You need energy to get from your house to the store to buy that tomato and bring it home, right? So with no energy, there's no way that the tomato is going to show up in your house, right?
Fair.
Same thing for water, right? Water has a certain weight wherever the water is in your country to wherever you're going to be using it. Again, 10% of typical countries' energy usage goes towards the water system, right? Pumping, treating, cleaning, etc. So what we're trying to show is that there's a correlation up to a certain point. But once you get past that point, it just becomes kind of wasteful in the sense that in the United States, a very suburban-oriented, car-oriented system does not necessarily have a higher HDI than a very urban transit and bike and walking oriented system. But maintaining that suburban car oriented system is going to use a lot more energy for the same quality of life. So there's a correlation in terms of what you're doing with the energy. And what you do with the energy has a correlation with the HDI. But when you start to talk about efficiency, you can bend that curve down, if that makes sense.
No, that makes actually a lot of sense. Okay.
Yeah, and that's why, for example, when you look at some of these countries that are around 0.9 HDI with 50 to 60 kilowatt hours a day, like, you could actually go to whichever country this is, and by using that energy better, they could probably bump up to 0.8, 0.85 without too much challenge. But this country down here is going to have a lot of trouble. They need a lot more generation, right? And a country like this could meet its climate goals by just closing down some of the really high polluting power plants and becoming more efficient, right? So there's always this question of like, okay, you shut down your coal plants, what do you replace it with? And the answer is, well, here you replace with clean energy. Here, maybe you don't replace it at all. Maybe you just have more efficient things that are plugged into the wall on the other end, right? So it's a bit of a balance.
Interesting. Nice. I have other questions, but I'll let other people ask theirs first.
Cool.
Manuel, do you want to ask your questions about sinks?
Yes, thank you very much, Karthik. This has been very, very interesting. So you mentioned the fact that sinks are critical, in order to basically achieve the numbers that we need to achieve. So what do you think are the best carbon sinks to focus on, and how do you think oceans should be leveraged versus other carbon sinks? And then the last piece is, how can corporations or startups really try to increase that use of the carbon sinks?
So two things. I think first, I'm not an expert on carbon sinks or carbon capture. It's something we work with, but I'm not an expert specifically on further ocean. So if there's someone else in the audience who is, you can raise your hands, and I'd love to hear your take. But one of the things that we've seen is, first off, there's a tendency on the part of corporations to say, we'll buy some carbon credits without really caring. We'll buy, we'll plant some trees. And I think that there's a challenge there in terms of, I think forestry by itself and forest health is important, but using forest health as a way to purely offset carbon emissions is challenging, because as the earth gets warmer, you're going to have more and more forest fires, you're gonna have more and more diseases that go between the trees. So like, Microsoft, for example, is very famously net negative at this point, except like 15% of the project they used in Oregon to offset their emissions had burned in the last wildfire season. So are they still net negative? What are they doing about that, right? So I think the whole issue of permanence is actually quite critical, right? So when you start thinking about what kind of sinks, if you're in agriculture, thinking about your soil health, for example, right? So we're starting to do some work with farms, and soil health for them has been kind of important, but not so much, especially if they're dealing with animals. So thinking about that. And I think when you talk about corporations and startups ramping up the carbon sinks, I think that a big part of that has to do with understanding the amount of risk that they're willing to take and having a real accounting of what is the permanence risk? What is that overhang risk going to be, right? Because if year after year after year, you're buying offsets, you basically have a larger and larger pool of credits that if your solution isn't permanent, one day you're gonna have to replace. And so I think one of the things that we're really interested in is seeing how companies can come together to actually drive their credit purchases against sinks that actually are permanent on the timescales that they can actually decarbonize with it, right? So for example, if you're going to decarbonize in 10 years, maybe you don't care about permanence too much with the credits you're buying today. But if you're an industry that's going to take 30, 40 years, you need to be thinking about much more permanent solutions. Not the greatest kind of detailed answer, but it is one of those things where I think we know a lot of the challenges with sinks, right? In terms of permanence, in terms of additionality, but we're still solving those challenges, right? But I think that is part of the challenge, is that there's no good solution quite yet that's been scaled, right? We have a lot of prototypes. And so where I see corporations helping, especially the larger ones, is saying, you know what, we'll just go ahead and take a flyer on this. This seems to have worked in a pilot. We'll go ahead and try it, knowing that in 10 years, we might have to go and buy those credits again. And I think that's going to be really critical, because if you're buying credits from the perspective of we're done and we can forget about it, then you might not as well not have bought it, because if the project fails, there's all you've done is time shifted the emissions. I think the way that you help as a corporation is buying the credits, but having a buffer available to rebuy those credits at a later date if whatever you purchased in ends up not panning out. Because we are in the early days of a lot of technology, right?
Sure. Got it. Thank you. I also had another question, but I'll let other people ask also.
I think so far the only questions I've seen are Jay and Manuel. So if either of you wants to ask away, go for it.
Sure. So the other question that I had was around cities. You mentioned the fact that cities are, with the huge migration that we're seeing of more and more people being in cities. Within cities, what do you see as the biggest opportunities? Is it on, on the building side? Is it on the energy, evolution side? Where do you see as the biggest opportunity on the urban side?
I think there's two. I think one of them is around cooling, quite frankly. Air conditioning uses a huge amount of power. And if everybody who lives in a part of the world where air conditioning is necessary actually gets access to AC, that by itself is going to have a 1/4 degree to a 1/2 degree of warming impact. Just air conditioning, right? So like building insulation, building quality, heat retention, there's a lot of work on like passive house type things, which works really well in certain climates, not as well in other climates. But again, I live in California, and the buildings here are constructed without heating and cooling in mind. Like you turn off the heater and it's freezing in like an hour. Whereas in, places that actually get cold, like you can turn off the heater and it'll remain warm inside because the insulation of the building is designed to retain the heat. And in the winter, the summer, it's retained to keep the cold air in when you run the air conditioning. So buildings by far number one, because if you're sitting inside and there's a heat wave and it's 115 degrees Fahrenheit outside, you're going to run that air conditioner, whether or not you are a believer of climate change. You're going to be like, I cannot survive indoors, I'm running that AC. It's just going to happen. And people are going to buy that AC as soon as they can afford it, right? Like, doesn't matter how staunch you are about having to cut emissions. If it's 110 degrees inside, you're going to cool your place down. So there's a little bit of effort being spent on heating and cooling. I think it needs to be a lot of effort. It's not as simple as saying heat pumps, because an AC basically is a heat pump, right? And the heat pump is just two-way air conditioning where you're pumping the heat in or out. That's one thing, but building environment, 100%. Because once you solve the building environment challenge, a huge amount of energy consumption that is kind of discretionary, if you will, goes away.
Thanks.
By the way, Manuel, on your earlier question, not necessarily on sinks, but on carbon offsets, we do have a deep dive on Thursday talking about that.
Awesome.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, the way that I think about sort of the sinks is, it is technologically very early, right? I think that they're going to be critical, like 100% the math, you need to do it. But there's a lot of unknowns for sure.
And because of what you mentioned about foresting, I think that's where potentially oceans, could have a bigger opportunity. But I'm just in early stages of exploration. But
I think one of the things that would be really interesting to figure out is, there's a lot of efforts around improving forest health, right? We've had mass deforestation, we've had monocultures, things like that in logging areas that need to be replaced with sort of more natural kind of things. And I think what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years is that we've tied forest health to carbon removal. And I think the reality is that in some places, for example, the forest density is actually higher than it should be, right? So California, for example, is assuming that the forest density is going to go up by 15 to 20%, and that's going to offset a bunch of their emissions. But a lot of the wildfires are caused because, trees are getting diseased, they're falling on power lines, things like that. But the reason the diseases are spreading is because the density of trees is higher than they've been historically, right? And so how do we decouple forest health from carbon credits? Because we should be improving forest health in a way that is natural for where that forest is, whether that's increasing the density of the trees, whether that is maintaining a natural density of trees, whether that's planting trees that are naturally suited for that environment versus, I've seen proposals where it's, let's clear cut the trees that are here and plant trees that grow a lot more quickly because they're going to sink carbon faster. Is that really going to be a solution? Maybe from the carbon budget perspective, but not from the whole ecosystem perspective, right? So being able to decouple those things becomes really critical. And I think that's a really interesting question for a startup to figure out is like, can you make money on forest health that doesn't simply maximize for the number of credits you're selling? Because that gives you a perverse incentive. I see a hand raised.
Hi, Karthik. Shraddha here. Thank you. This was really interesting and lots of food for thought. My question was saying that, is it like, let's say when you said that like, the whole basket of solutions that we need for our goals for 2030 already exists. So like, are we just missing like the regulatory push? Is that what it'll take? Or is it like still like there's a mix of market forces as well at play? And like, how do you see that tension getting solved? Because I don't know if all countries will act in time, and then by the time the regulation comes through, whether we'll have enough time left. So just wanted to pick your thoughts on how do you see this panning out?
So this is actually the problem that we started Actual to solve, which is that like we absolutely 100% need a lot of R&D to hit the goals of 2040 and 2050. Like, so I'm not saying that we have all the tech to solve climate change today, like definitely not. But if you're a company with a goal of 2030, there's something out there you can sign a PO for today. The problem is, number one, a lot of these organizations, they're not sure what to sign the PO for, right? So to Jay's point, what is the package you're going to bring to the CFO and say, here's what you should sign off on. We need $1 billion to do this, or we need $300 million to do this. What is that package going to look like? So there's a lot of uncertainty about that. There's a lot of uncertainty in the finance side, because everyone is putting together green bonds and ESG linked ETFs and all this kind of stuff. So the money is there, like definitely. But how do you justify the plan to get access to that money? Number one. Number two, there is the regulatory uncertainty because, for example, the SEC is starting to think about regulating ESG ETFs and like, what does it mean when when a company puts a net zero pledge forward, they get a boost in their stock price. They have access to lower cost of capital. So now the SEC is saying, well, your pledges are now material impacts on your financial health. So we're going to start to regulate that. So companies are now starting to say, wait a minute, I made this pledge. If I pick this technology and it doesn't work, am I going to be held accountable by the SEC? Right. So there's a bit of regulatory uncertainty as well around, I missed the goal because I made the wrong choice. What do I do about that? So I think what's missing is literally that last step of how do you build confidence in the person who's signing the check to buy the thing and deploy it? Because, for example, if your city says we want to have a zero emissions transit network, if you're a company that has buses, like the city of Shenzhen in China, 1 year was just like, yeah, in 18 months, all the diesel buses are going to be gone. And you go to Shenzhen, there's no diesel buses. They're just like, all the taxis are going to be electric, and they're electric, right? So you can do those kinds of big shifts. The money is there, the technology is there, but the person who's signing the check needs to get the confidence that the risk of buying that thing is not going to get them fired, basically. That's a challenge to solve.
Yeah, but like
for the near term.
No, but like, yeah. So I'm in India, and like I think democracy itself kind of sometimes does not help some of these decisions. Second, like when it comes to businesses, let's say even evaluating, let's say, solutions to decarbonize, I've often found like the willingness to pay is just not there. Like saying at least. So I'm just curious, like how are you kind of, and I'm sure like US is a little more evolved and ahead than India is, but it'd be like good to hear from you, like what was your experience like when you started Actual, and like was it like a lot of resistance, and as time went on the resistance went away?
Yeah, I think the resistance is there when people don't realize that you can actually have a return on the investment, right? So for example, one of the first projects we did was with a county in Central California, which was trying to figure out how to justify switching from high pressure sodium to LED streetlights. And they were thinking about it as a cost. And when we did the modeling, we're like, well, look, there's a capex, but the savings over time is very good. And so you have it between, depending on the model of LED you put in there, whether you put motion sensors in your neighborhoods where there's less traffic or not, et cetera, you're going to get somewhere between 11 and 25% IRR. And they're looking at that and saying, wait a minute, we can issue a bond at like a few percentage, like very low interest rate. And we're going to make money on this still because we can capture the rest of that return. But thinking about it from that perspective, right? Because they were trying to make the case from the perspective of emissions. Oh, maybe we can buy some credits, or we can generate some credits or something. And then there's all this questions about, well, is the carbon market developed? Can we do this and what have you? That's in California, which has one of the most developed carbon markets. But as soon as we came in and said, no, this is an investment. There's capex up front, there's operational savings, there's an IRR of double digits. Suddenly it became, oh yeah, okay. We'll eminent domain the power pole, the light poles from PG&E. Like we'll just sue the utility, buy the poles, put LED lights up and call it a day. It's worth it because there's an ROI, and I'm going to have to issue a bond, but the costs are more than covered. That changed the calculus. At that point, they were like, actual, you guys go do your thing. Now we know what to do. And like, I think that is really critical. I think one of the challenges in India is when we talk about like equity and finance, is the fact that a lot of the finance that's coming in, especially development bank finance from the US and Europe, is backed by, or sort of the payer of last resort is the Indian government, right? So if the Indian government goes and says, we're going to shut down this coal plant, the Indian government is basically forced to pay the international investor for their losses, right? So I think this is where the regulatory challenge becomes really critical, because why would the Indian government pass legislation that costs them a bunch of money to shut down a power plant when they could use that money for clean water, for healthcare, for things like that, right? So in that case, sort of the question is, how do you make these plants less competitive without having to have the government force a shutdown of these plants? Because about half of Indian coal plants are going to be within their design lifetime, even after 2050. Like, there's a reason why the net zero goal is 2070.
Yeah.
You know, it's because by about 2060, most of these loans are no longer going to be backed by Indian government sort of guarantees. So the Indian government at that point can say, shut that plant down without incurring a cost. So it's a real kind of it's a real challenge. And I think this is where sort of the traditional methods of international finance have actually, you know, you have, for example, the European and American governments on one hand saying, got to decarbonize, but then the way they're financing projects in other markets makes it harder to decarbonize. So, you know, when I talk about, is your solution going to be deployable in these countries without having to use these older forms of finance? That's really critical, because there's kind of a skittishness to use it, because they're realizing, wait a minute, like, yeah, they paid for this coal plant. They're telling us to shut the plant down. But if we do what they tell us to do, I have to pay them back. You're not going to shut it down. This is not going to happen.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the answer, the questions. Karthik, it's been an hour, a little over. Don't want to take too much of your time. Do you have a few minutes? Do people have other questions? And do you need to run, Karthik?
I do, but I have maybe another minute or so. And if anyone wants to chat, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'll just put it in the chat here. Just shoot me an email. Always happy to chat more. You know, now, in a week, in a month, in a year, whenever, just shoot me an email. Always happy to chat.
Thank you so much for that. Thanks for your time today and for this great talk. Thank you all for joining. I think with that, we should wrap up and again, say thank you and have a great day, everybody.
Cool. Thanks for your time. Thanks, everybody. And hope you have a good day.